Let's talk about Palestine. Recently, you've probably heard on the news at some point or another about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that is currently going on to this very day. But the real question is, how did it actually start? Well, the land called Israel today has actually a very long and complicated history. Dating back to before 1948, it was actually called Palestine originally under the rule of the Ottoman Empire. It had actually been under the Ottoman rule for centuries and had developed its own distinct culture with a combination of Muslim, Christian, and Jewish people all together living in Palestine. And they had bustling marketplaces with vast olive groves, farmland, and blooming industries and trade centers. Often the Zionists say that the land was inhabited by Jewish people 2,000 years ago. And this previous inhabitants actually justifies the formation of Israel as a state on that land. This, regardless, is actually not a justification for the establishment of a Jewish state by committing ethnic cleansing of Palestinian inhabitants. Before Zionism, 25% of Palestinians were Jewish, so that land was technically already inhabited by Jewish people. Saying that a certain group of people were owed a land does not give group justification to ethnically cleanse the people who were living on that land previously. So we talk a little bit about Zionism, right? But what actually is this ideology? Zionism was created by Theodor Herzl in the 1880s, and Zionism is the ideology that Jewish people need a Jewish nation state to protect them from anti-Semitism. This ideology was actually spurred from the massive amounts of anti-Semitism that Jewish people received in Europe during this time period. Theodor Herzl then recruited like-minded people, as you do, to create the World Zionist Organization. This organization then began to look for places which they can build their Jewish state. They considered Argentina and Uganda, but then settled on Palestine for its spiritual history, aka the Bible. At the time, Palestine was actually still under Ottoman Empire rule during the late 1880s. And you might now be wondering, how can you take over a state like that that's still under massive influence from another massive state? Well, that's called losing. The Ottoman Empire lost during World War I, and Britain then began to think about taking over Palestine because of increased lobbying from, you guessed it, the World Zionist Organization. So, the League of Nations, basically the young UN at the time, partitioned the Ottoman Empire's territory between Britain and France, giving them rule over this land. Britain's mandate included Palestine. Britain then issued the Balfour Declaration in 1917, declaring support for the creation of a Jewish state occupied in Palestine, which increased support for Zionism worldwide, obviously, and set the stage for a Zionist intention for the British Mandate of Palestine. My dear viewer, you might be asking about, hey, so what does that actually mean for the new land of Palestine? Well, during the late 1880s to 1920s, after World War I, many Jewish Europeans began moving to this new Holy Land. So, after Zionism's influence started to increase, especially after the Balfour Declaration, lots of European Jewish people began moving to Palestine in the tens of thousands. And naturally, Palestinians were really confused because this was technically still their land. However, Britain said, no, it's okay. We'll take care of that for you and we'll protect your civil rights. However, this actually proved to be very false because Palestinians' voices were actually disregarded during this intense time period of massive immigration. Palestinian voices were disregarded in the British Mandate, and they had no say in whatsoever on the Zionist takeover of the land that they had actually originally cultivated for centuries. So, obviously, sticking to their word, Britain actually deceptively made laws that removed land holdings from Palestinians and redistributed this land to Zionist settlers. So, as more and more Palestinians became landless due to these new laws, they were actually displaced to the outskirts of Zionist settlements, places where they used to live. And as quoted by the Palestine Nexus, they, Zionists, transformed Palestine from 10% Jewish in 1918 to 33% Jewish in 1947, buying up 6 to 8% of the land and wiping 70 Arab villages off the map and uprooting more than 10,000 Palestinians and Arabs in the process. And to top it off, Zionists actually started massacring Palestinians, murdering thousands of them in their own villages. Soon, since all of this murdering was going on, Palestinians formed committees and delegations to argue and voice their opinions on a democratically elected rule, including Christians, Muslims, and Jewish people, instead of having just solely British and Zionist rule. This, however, was obviously not listened to. So, soon after World War II, the newly created United Nations had a partition plan for Palestine, especially since the Holocaust displaced a lot of European Jewish people. So, they created the Palestine Partition Plan of 1947, which divided Palestine into the Gaza Strip and West Bank that we know today. The State of Israel was, for some reason, given 56.47% of the landmass, and the rest of the landmass was given to the Palestinians to avoid further conflict. Were formed as the West Bank, administered by Jordan, and the Gaza Strip, which was administered by Egypt. Following the UN partition plan, around 80% of Palestinians, or around 750,000 people, were expelled from Palestine through violence enacted by Israel. Thousands of Palestinians were then murdered by Israel as the forming state continued to erase villages to make way for Israel's creation. Through psychological, biological, and physical warfare, such as targeted violence, broadcasted noise, and intimidation torture, poisoning village wells, and, massacres and rape, Israel decimated Palestinian society. By the end of the war, Israel controlled 78% of the land area from the former mandatory Palestine. The State of Israel was then founded on May 14, 1948, following Nakba and the expulsion of over 750,000 Palestinians, a date you're probably familiar with after the most recent bombing of the Gaza Strip. So, after the forming state asserted control over the land, the official State of Israel was then created. The establishment of Israel and the occupation of Palestinian territories paved way for decades more conflict, which lasts until today. Thank you so much for watching until the end. Educating yourself on the history of Palestine and the conflict that is currently going on does a lot more than you think it does, because ignorance only helps yourself and doesn't really help others. Because you're a good person, so you want to help other people out. But this is only the first part, so please stay tuned for the second and third parts that are yet to come out pretty soon. Thank you again for watching, and Annika out. Stupid thing off. Israel was then founded on May 14th, 1978. What the fuck?